Hello, I'm Karen from theneedlefelter.com. In this video, we're tackling the question, how do I make a wire armature? This is FAQ number 8, and I'm going to introduce you to a variety of armature wires, share how I approach making armatures, and we'll make one. Let's get started. I've been thinking a lot about this FAQ series, and I thought it might be helpful for the remaining questions on my list to go ahead and make an animal to help answer them. So I designed a male lion, and we'll make him bit by bit over the next couple months. I made a pattern. The link to download it is in my blog post and the pinned comment below, and you can always find any of my free patterns on my website, theneedlefelter.com. So we have a side view of our lion, I have a top view, and then the view we'll be focusing on today is the side view with the armature. But before we start the armature, let's talk about armatures and wire. Here are examples of armatures I've made in the past. So what is an armature? I think of it as the structure you create, usually out of wire, to serve as a base to build your wool animal on. So why use an armature? Armatures provide support for animals with thin or delicate features. For instance, the tusk on the narwhal, the legs on my little chick. They can support a heavy body, so in this case I've got these little tiny legs and a pretty good sized body. If I tried to make this chick without a wire armature, it would just collapse. Understanding the purpose for it will help you decide how sturdy your armature needs to be, what type of wire you need, what gauge wire, and where you might need extra support. You'll also need to decide if you want to make a one-piece armature or make the armature in multiple pieces. We're going to make a bit of a hybrid armature for the lion, but first, let's talk about wire. As with the felting needles, wire also comes in gauges. The higher the gauge number of the wire, the thinner the wire is. 18 gauge wire is thinner than 12 gauge wire, and 24 gauge wire is thinner than 18 gauge wire. I initially learned how to make wire armatures from Sarah Renzulli of Serafina Fiber Arts. Generally, she recommends using 22 gauge cloth covered wire armatures for animals under 6 inches in length, 14 gauge aluminum wire for animals between 6 to 12 inches in length, and 12 gauge aluminum wire for animals over 12 inches long. These are good general guidelines, but I've found that the gauge you need also varies depending on the animal you are making. For example, a deer has thin legs, but there are 4 of them. A chicken has thin legs, but there are only 2. So you may need a thicker gauge wire for the chicken than you do for the deer because there are only 2 legs supporting the weight of the body. The gauge you choose may also vary depending on the material your wire is made from. Let's take a look at a few materials used to make wire. The first type of armature wire you'll see pretty often is pipe cleaners or chenille stems. I tend not to use them because they aren't very strong and the wire inside them is brittle. They're usually made of a thin steel wire, and you can snap them if you bend them back and forth too much. They also have very sharp ends. Floral wire tends to be stiffer and less flexible. I found it listed as iron or stainless steel wire. It's often sold as floral wire or wire for flower stems. Floral wire is available in different colors. I don't worry too much about the color I'm purchasing unless it's for tiny toes or antlers. Most of the time the wire will be completely covered, but you might see a glimpse of it through a tiny toe or an antler. It's also made with different coatings. We'll talk about those in a few minutes, but let's finish up with the wire materials first. Craft wire tends to be soft and flexible, but it varies by brand. I found it listed as containing aluminum or copper, but often it doesn't say what it is. Craft wire is also available in different colors. I tend to buy silver tone, gold tone, or copper tone because those colors work great for claws. With copper wire, most of what you'll see is the soft and flexible type, which is technically called dead soft. That's a wire term. You can order it in half hard, which is stiffer than the dead soft. Either one works, but I usually order the softer wire because it stiffens up as you twist it. Aluminum wire is very soft and very flexible. I order this in 12 gauge, 14 gauge, and 16 gauge. I have 18 gauge, but I find it harder to use for armatures because it's almost too flexible, but I do find uses for it. Galvanized steel wire is much stiffer and not nearly as flexible. Because it's so stiff, I struggle to use it for actual armatures, but these thin gauges, say 22 to 28, were great for building clay claws, beaks, or horns on. For my armatures, I use cloth wrapped wire or bare wire. You can also buy plastic or paper coated wire and painted wire. For me, plastic coated, paper coated, and painted wire just don't add anything that I need in an armature wire, so I tend not to reach for them when I'm shopping for wire. Cloth wrapped wire is wonderful. The texture from the threads that wrap the wire help wool grip it. It's available in a limited range of gauges, typically 18 gauge to 24 gauge in stores like Hobby Lobby and Michaels in the United States, but you can find it online as thin as 32 gauge, and it comes in limited lengths, usually 12 to 18 inches because it's made for floral stems. Bare wire is available in all sorts of materials, gauges, and lengths. When you're wrapping wool on bare wire though, it does slip. So I usually put Elmer's glue all on the wire. It's an inexpensive and easy way to help the wool adhere to the wire. It also dries clear and fast. So for the lion, we're going to make this simple four-legged armature. It will look something like this. Your armature doesn't need to be perfect, it's just to support your sculpture. I'm going to use 3 pieces of 22 gauge cloth wrapped florist wire for this project. I chose this wire because it will provide plenty of support for the lion we're making, and it's easy to find on Amazon or in craft stores. I have 2 pieces that are 18 inches long and then a scrap of wire that I'll use to cut the tail. I'm using green, but you can use any color you have. This wire will be completely covered when the lion is completed. And I'm going to take one of my longer wires and fold it in half. I just sort of align the ends and then pinch it back to get the center. I'm going to leave a loop on the end, and I'm going to twist my wire down 2.5 inches from the top of the loop. So I'm going to use my sewing gauge. I just like the sewing gauge because I don't have to look at the numbers once I set it. I can just look at the marker. All right, so I want to go 2.5 inches from the top. I think I'll do it this way. It's a little easier. So I need a little bit more. That's perfect. So I've twisted down 2.5 inches from the top of the loop. Now I want to separate my 2 remaining wires to form this V shape. So the twisted wire will become the lion's neck and head. The 2 sides of my V will become the lion's front legs. So let's take our second 18-inch wire, fold that in half. I'm going to separate that into a V shape, and then I'm going to place this V shape over the base of the lion's neck. So we're right here. I have it placed over that base. Now I'm going to work with the 2 wires on the right side. So I'm going to spread this out a little bit, keeping that point of the V over the base of the neck. I'm going to take 1 long wire, 1 short wire on the right side, and I'm going to twist this twice. It doesn't have to be a really tight twist, so I twisted it once, so now my short wire's in the back and my longer wire's in the front. And then I'm going to twist it again so that my short wire is back in the front. This will make a shoulder of the lion. Now we want to repeat on the opposite side, so make sure when you start, your shorter wire is forward and your longer wire is facing back, just like that. So I want to twist it once to bring the longer wire forward and the shorter wire back, and then once more. So now my shorter wire is forward and my longer wire is facing back. So now you've got something like this with your shorter wires forward and your longer wires facing back. Now I'm going to spread my bottom twists out so that they are perpendicular to the neck wire. From there, what I'm going to do is move my two shorter wires, bend them forward, and bend the two longer wires back. So now they look kind of like an H. And the front will be the two shorter wires because these are going to be the front leg, and the back is the two longer wires. All right, so I'm going to cross my two longer wires over like that. And then I'm going to twist these two longer wires together 3.5 inches down from the base of the neck. So I'll start just loosely twisting them. This doesn't need to be tight. And then my measurement is going to be 3.5 inches. And I'm measuring from the base of the neck. So from this point right here where the neck stands up, I want to go 3.5 inches back. So I'm only about halfway there. Let me just twist a few more. A little bit further. So I'm just a little short, so I'm going to give it just one final twist. So now if I measure, I've got 3.5 inches from the base of the neck to the base of that twist. Now this is going to become the lion's hip. So once again, I'm going to leave my wire flat. I'm going to bend this out perpendicular, these two wires out perpendicular. So I want to bend about 1/4 inch hip down on either side. Right, so I want to measure about 1/4 inch out. I'm going to just take and bend that straight down. And then I'm going to repeat on the other side. So measure about 1/4 inch and do the same thing. And this gives my lion a little bit of a hip. So next we're making this bend right here. So I'm going to bend the leg slightly forward at 2.5 inches from the hip. So put my sewing gauge up at the hip and then just slightly bend that forward. And I'm going to do it on both legs. Slightly bend that forward. And then I'm going to gently curve that wire back to match the drawing. So just sort of make a gentle curve in that, and that's kind of, this is really where the lion's knee would be. So you're making that curve for the knee. And then do the same on the second one. Get that curve in for the knee. As you can see. Now we have to make this bend for the foot. So to make the bend for the foot, I want to bend forward at 1 inch. So got about 1 inch and just bend that forward. Okay. So now I've got my lion's foot. And I want to cut this wire at about 5/8 of an inch, and we'll make a little loop for the foot. I'm going to hold it this way so that I can just sort of line that up and then cut it. And then do the same on this side, just kind of line up where that bend is and cut off that excess wire. So I'm going to make a loop inward. So on this left leg, I'm going to loop it to the right. So just sort of kind of curve that in. Make a little loop for the foot. Straighten that so it'll look something like that. And then on the right side leg, I'm going to bend that to the left so that both of my loops are facing the center. Go ahead and bend that one in. Just sort of straighten it a little bit. So now I have both of my loops facing in towards the center. And I just want to check my armature with the pattern. And then we've got our back legs. Now we're ready to make the front legs. So I'm going to bend these wires down. Like that. You can check those with the pattern. So we're going to make a slight bend forward at 2 1/4 inches, and that'll be this bend right here. This is 2 1/4 inches from the shoulder. Make a slight bend forward and do the same on the other leg. So I'm going to go slightly forward. And then we'll gently make this curve in the front leg wire. So I want to kind of gently curve that back to match the pattern. And do the same on the other leg. Then you may also need to adjust this wire, this bottom end of the leg, to straighten it. And then we're going to make a slight bend forward at 1 inch for the foot. So measure down from this bend here 1 inch. And we'll bend that forward and do the same on this leg. Measure down 1 inch and bend forward. And then just like on the back, we're going to cut the foot at about 5/8 of an inch. Do the same on the other leg. And then I'm going to make a loop facing inward. So we'll bend the left leg, looking at the line from the back. We'll bend the left leg in to the right. Make that loop. And then we'll bend in the right leg. Make that loop. And then just sort of straighten your legs. So now I've got my 2 feet, my 2 front feet. And I'm going to just check those measurements. Looks pretty good. All right, but now this front is very floppy. So what I'm going to do is reinforce this with some hot glue. So I'm going to go ahead, turn on my hot glue gun, and wait for that to heat up. Add hot glue to the shoulder joint to stabilize it. If you don't have hot glue, you could use something like E6000, but you want a glue that's on the thicker side so that it just doesn't run down your armature. Before the glue cures, check the armature with the pattern. I also like to glue the hip joint just to keep it firm. And then set your armature aside to allow the glue to harden. Now we want to bend the neck forward. And we're going to make a bend down 1 inch from the end of this loop. So I want to go about 1 inch and bend that down. And this will be the lion's head. Adjust the legs for the armature so it stands up in a balanced way. And one thing I do to help me line up the legs is I'll place them on my mat because I have the grids and I can sort of see where the feet are falling. on my grid and check the alignment of the spine. So it's just an easy way to sort of make sure that your armature is balanced. Right, so this part's done. All we have left is to make the tail. And for the tail, I'm going to use my scrap of wire, and I'm just going to cut a 6-inch wire. We'll set this wire aside because we'll attach it near the end of the project. I could attach the tail now, but I'm doing it this way to show you that your armature doesn't have to include all the pieces right from the start. You can make certain pieces separately and then attach them as your sculpture progresses. We'll keep working on this lion a little bit each week as we answer upcoming questions. But that's it for this FAQ. I hope you found it helpful and it inspires you to felt something. And if you don't felt, make something. See you next time.